Time for our Legal Corner. It is brought to you by Maserati Montreal, where you can check out the brand new Grecale SUV. Yeah, a Maserati SUV. Leasing rate starting at only 2.99%. It is an amazing ride from an amazing brand. See it at Maserati Montreal online. That's MaseratiMontreal.com or in their showroom, 8525 DeCary Boulevard, Maserati Montreal. Time to check in with Chris Dimakos, our CJAD 800 legal contributor. And so we're going to start off with something we've actually talked a lot about, employees, employers, but from a different perspective today. So we had job numbers come out this week. Unemployment now up to 6.9%. And it could get worse. And given what's going on right now between Canada and the U.S., that's actually what economists are projecting. So here's the problem. It looks like given this, employers are kind of in the driver's seat here, Chris. So that said, it looks like more is going to be asked of employees. What do we do here? First of all, with respect to overtime, if that's what's going to happen, what do you do? How does it work? What can you be asked to do? What can't you be asked to do?
Right, and with job numbers coming out, a lot of the companies now are either on a hiring freeze or they're looking to their existing team to say, hey, everyone has to pick up the slack. Everyone's got to get a little bit better and put in a little more work to get through this tough time. So a lot of times that involves maybe working a little later than you're usually working, and the question always comes, hey, I usually leave at 5. But today I had to stay until 6:30 or 7. Am I automatically entitled to overtime? And the way it works in Quebec is that in Quebec, it presumes you work on a 40-hour work week. So even if you don't have a contract that specifically states you work from 9 to 5 every single day, I mean, if it does, great. If it doesn't, it presumes you're on a 40-hour work week. So if you work more than 40 hours, technically you're entitled to overtime. There is one exception, though. And if you're paid on an annual salary basis, so if you accepted a job where they pay you $65,000, $75,000, $85,000 a year, and that's what your contract writes, and there's no mention of how many hours per week you are to be working, well, then overtime wouldn't come into play in those scenarios unless you're working an extreme amount of hours where, your salary then becomes less than minimum wage. It's very, very, very doubtful that will be the case. But so, to resume, you're always entitled to overtime if you work more than 40 hours, unless you're paid on an annual salary basis where the hours that you work make no part of your employment contract.
Yeah, well, good luck trying to figure out those hours, right? If you're paid on an annual salary and break them down to hours you work, I imagine that's a lot of work in and of itself just to see if you're entitled to more. But what happens when you say, or if you say, no, I have a 40-hour work week, you're paying me to do this job, and your employer says, well, look, you need to do it only this week, it's not going to happen again, and then, of course, it happens again. At what point do you simply get to say as the employee, no, I'm not going to do this without fearing losing your job?
Right, that's a very good question. So there are scenarios where an employee can say no. There are limits to how much overtime you can work. Also, if you have personal reasons, if you have to take care of a loved one, there are times where you are justified in saying no. But if it's just a question of, I don't feel like working the overtime because I don't want to work more than 40 hours a week, there you can get into some trouble and some disciplinary measures. So the employer does have the right to ask you to work a little longer to get the job done, and they'll obviously have to pay you overtime for that. But you do have cases where you can say no without being disciplined, but just simply saying, I don't feel like it, it's probably not going to be enough for you to avoid getting disciplined for that. Another point that's really important when it comes to these things is employers are well aware of this, and they're well aware of the fact that some employees obviously don't want to work the overtime. In fact, some of them don't even want to be in the office 5 days a week. They want to be remote work, and employers now are trying to, patch that gap up with more part-time work and less full-time. So when they're met with these types of responses, a lot of times employers say, you know what, we're gonna reduce this person's hours, and we're going to hire another part-time employee to try and make up the difference. So again, the employer does have some discretion as to how much overtime you have to work, but you are getting paid for that time and a half. But there are scenarios where you can say, no, I can't do this because of personal reasons or because of having worked beyond what the limit is to how many hours you can work in a day or a week.
So let me go to that then part. I mean, at the high end of this, right? Let's say you're doing your standard 40-hour work week, and for whatever reason, your employer is now forcing you to do overtime, and it comes to more than 50 hours a week. Where does it cut off? Where is it simply a matter of, no, you can't just keep asking for more and more and more? Is there a cutoff?
Yeah, there is a cutoff. There are cutoffs based on whether you're working on a weekly basis or on the daily basis. There are certain numbers that come into play with the labor standards that we have here, but usually where the conflict arises between the employee and the employer, it's not so much on a isolated incident. It's when it becomes the new norm. So, for example, we have labor standards here in Quebec that say, hey, you can't work a certain amount of hours within a day, or you can't work, in a week, you can't exceed this many hours in a 72-hour period. There are a whole bunch of different rules and numbers and regulations, but what happens is when the job itself starts to change, when your work week is not exceptionally 50 hours, but it's becoming the norm. It's something that's new, even though you're getting paid for it. After a while, employees start saying, okay, well, it looks like now my job is no longer 40 hours a week. It looks like it's going to be 50 hours a week, and it's going to be that way as far as I can see. It's time to start looking at whether or not we change my contract and I get paid in a different way. So what the problems usually employers and employees run into is not that those isolated events. It's when it becomes the new norm, and then the employee says, hey, I have commitments. I have personal things I have to take care of. I can't work these hours consistently week after week. That's where we start seeing some conflict, and that's where it usually ends up where one party either quits, resigns, or the other one takes measures. So the isolated incidents, I would say, are not the big issue. It's when the company says, we're going to have to ride these employees a little tougher for a long period here until we get through this difficult patch, and the employees are just not able to do it because of their personal lives and their commitments to their family and their children and their activities that they do on a weekly basis. So
just last question, you mentioned renegotiating, say, a contract, for example. I mean, based on these extra hours that you're then putting in regularly, what if it's a job change in the middle of that? Do you renegotiate or do you keep the old contract?
Yeah, you absolutely renegotiate. And what you want to have in your contract, this is for everybody, anytime an employer wants to sit you down and say, okay, listen, we let go of 20 employees, we're reconfiguring our workforce, you're going to have to take on more. What you want is you want to have all the changes accounted for, not just in terms of your responsibilities, but how is the company going to deal with that change on your plate? So are you going to get paid more in terms of the salary? Is it bonuses? Are your targets changing? Because what happens usually is once you accept these changes, now your performance evaluations are based on these new targets, these new objectives. So there's a change there, not only from a responsibility perspective, but from a job stability perspective. So you want to make sure that the targets are reasonable, your objectives are reasonable, that you're getting compensated accordingly. All of these things have to align, because if there's an imbalance, if you take a job, the new responsibilities, and the targets or the expectations are not realistic for you, you can find yourself facing, consecutive negative performance reviews that can have you out of a job within a year or year and a half. So again, if you're going to have that new position, make sure that everything aligns properly, the expectations are managed, you're compensated accordingly, because if not, you might take yourself out of a very stable job and be putting yourself into a very unstable job, and that's not good for you or for your long-term equity that you work so hard to accumulate.
And that's where we leave it. Chris, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Aaron.
Chris Dimakos, our CJAD 800 legal contributor, and our feature brought to you by Maserati Montreal. Go visit the showroom and take a look at the beautiful Maserati SUV called Grecale. You'll see it on the showroom floor, but better than that, take it for a test drive, because as I say, one test drive is all you need. You'll be blown away by this car, SUV. Grecale from Maserati Montreal, 8525 DeCarry Boulevard, or online, MaseratiMontreal.com.